Good eve- Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on which part of the globe you're at. This is the payment system broadcast number 20. We're going to talk about consumer protection and fraud in payments. We're going to start in a couple of seconds. Please, everyone join and get comfortable. In the meantime, a little bit of housekeeping. So as usual, what we're going to have is a very lively, friendly conversation with our two co-speakers today, Oliver Hanmer and Dave McPhee, which are going to introduce themselves in a couple of seconds. So we're going to have this lively, friendly conversation for the first 45 minutes. Afterwards, we expect to have at least 10 to 15 minutes to discuss the questions that the public is going to send through the widget that is included in WebEx, that you will find it in the three dots that you have on the bottom right part of the WebEx screen. So that's enough for introduction and housekeeping. So let's present our co-speakers for today. So, as I already mentioned, we have Oliver Hanmer, who is the Head of Supervision and Compliance Monitoring at PSR, and Dave McPhee, which is the Chief Policy and Engagement Officer at Pay UK. I will give each one of you not only my thanks or our thanks for joining us today, but also 1 minute for you to introduce yourselves and also to give any disclaimers that you deem needed at this point. So once again, welcome, Oliver and Dave. Oliver.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. No disclaimers that I can think of from me. I'm Oliver. I'm Head of Supervision and Compliance Monitoring at the Payment Systems Regulator in the UK. We are an independent regulator with primary responsibility for payment systems. My role is in ensuring that we have a strategic approach to how we engage with payment systems operators, but also that the regulatory interventions that we have made in respect of fraud, for example, are adhered to in the right way by banks and other financial institutions. So I have that broader compliance monitoring and enforcement responsibility, as well as a strategic engagement role.
Thank you, Oliver. Dave?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, Dave McPhee from Pay.UK. So I'm the Pay.UK's Chief Policy and Engagement Officer. Pay.UK is the recognised in the UK for the interbank retail payment systems. My role covers a few disciplines, I guess, regulatory affairs, internal and external communications, public affairs, stakeholder engagement more generally, and what we call strategic policy. So really looking forward to getting into an interesting conversation today.
Thank you, Dave and Oliver. Just to introduce our topic today, which is consumer protection and fraud in payments. I think we all know, and this has been a recurring topic here at the payment system broadcast at the FNA, about fraud, about scams, and how there should be like protection measures for people, including not only the identification and detection of fraudsters and scammers. So it's about preventing those actors in the payment industry, or not in the industry, in the payment network at the end, preventing them from damaging or from affecting the people who are trying to make their payments. But also something that at FNA we are also very keen on pushing forward is about how to get the recovery of the money, because at the end, most likely there is no system that is able to detect and to prevent 100% of all the cases of frauds and scams, but also there should be some measures to get the money back to the people, which at the end the ultimate form of consumer protection. So today, and that's what we're so happy of having you both here, is that we are going to have we expect a very rich conversation or discussion about how regulatory and industry-led interventions and how the role of data in fraud risk mitigation is going forward in the UK, and to try to understand how we're going, or what examples or what experiences from the UK can also be applicable or helpful for other payment systems. So at the end, this is the whole point of this very lively and friendly conversation that we're expecting to have. So let's start with the first question. So in this first question, Oliver, I would like you we would like to set the stage. So I would like you to outline the strategic priorities of PSR in enhancing the consumer protection within payments, particularly in striking the right balance between countering fraud and seamless user experience in fast payments. And for David, from an industry leadership perspective, how is PayUK shaping the payment ecosystem to align these regulatory imperatives while fostering innovation and efficiency? So thank you once again, both of you. Oliver.
Okay, shall I kick off, Dave? I'll just give an overview of the approach the PSR has taken to fraud, which is a top priority and has been a top priority for us for a number of years. I think because of the scale of authorized push payment fraud and the impact that it has on the victims of fraud, we really view this as a high priority for us. So what we have tried to do in relation to our regulation is to balance consumer protection. So if you're a victim of a fraud, how are you protected by financial institutions, with incentivizing financial institutions, banks, etc., to continue to invest in fraud prevention. So that becomes a sort of push and pull approach to regulation that you're seeing. And there are a couple of significant regulatory interventions that we have made. It's just worth highlighting. We can go into more detail as we go through the session, but just at a high level, we introduced what's called confirmation of payee, which is a name checking service, which has been used, I think, for around 2.5 billion transactions since it was introduced. And that is designed to give consumers confidence that when they're making that transaction, they know who they are engaging with on the other side. And there's a process that follows to ensure that the information you're inputting into making that transfer in terms of the name, the sort code, the account details are accurate, and therefore you've got that confidence. And then the second, which we introduced in October last year, is authorized push payment reimbursement. So authorized push payments, for those who may not know, is where somebody's kind of duped into making a transfer by a fraudster into a different account. So that's the kind of authorized, as in you authorize the transfer to happen. And in October, we introduced a mandatory requirement that if you are the victim of a APP fraud, then the banks have a responsibility to reimburse you up to £85,000, which I think covers around 99% of fraud claims, and to split that liability between sending and receiving firms. So you've got both sides of the equation taking a degree of responsibility for reimbursing customers who've been the subject of fraud. So that is the approach that we take, and then in creating that expectation around reimbursement, you're incentivizing banks to try to prevent fraud from happening in the first place, and that's where you're seeing some really interesting and innovative ways of making good use of AI and technology to identify fraud at the earliest point, and to do so in a way that, I think, as you said in the question, achieves that sort of frictionless approach to payments. So yeah, that's the headline. So you've got those two things that we've introduced, which are designed to have a push and pull impact in respect of protecting customers, but also encouraging investment in fraud prevention.
That's great. David.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just build upon Oliver's answer there, and maybe just sort of set out the distinction between sort of the regulatory imperatives and the regulatory drivers here, and what we as a payment system operator are doing to operationalize some of those requirements and play our leading role within the industry more generally. I think it's worth just talking about context here. You know, the systems that Pay.UK operates, the faster payment systems, the back systems and the check systems, I mean, they process people's salaries, they process people's bills, they do benefit payments, they do pension payments. You know, we process over 10 trillion volume annually, totaling 11.5 billion transactions. And I'm not mentioning that just to kind of have numbers bingo, but I think what it means is sort of confidence in those systems is really important. And although, you know, APP and fraud across those systems don't originate within the faster payment system, the very nature of the faster payment system means they can be used for those kind of fraudulent transactions. And although the overall percentage is very low, it's something like 0.007% of transactions are APP reimbursement transactions. It's important that for two reasons, that there are mechanisms in place so those victims of fraud are reimbursed, as Oliver talked about, but also the overall trust and confidence in those systems are maintained, because they're important for the broader economy and to foster innovation and efficiency, as you said in your question. And that's why, as a payment system operator, we've taken an increasing role over the last few years in thinking about how we as an organisation can help sort of support the industry more generally in reducing the impacts of fraud, working both with the regulator, but also, you know, banks, building societies and PSPs more generally. And that was very much a new role for Pay.UK as a payment system operator. It wasn't something we focused on at all two or so years ago, I guess. And picking up on the two examples that Oliver used and our role in that in particular. So on the confirmation of payee service, Oliver's right, they mandated that service, but it was for Pay.UK as the operator of the systems to set the rules and standards and sort of run the overall industry project to ensure that payment service providers migrated to those new set of rules and standards. And there's over 300 PSPs, something like 99% of the market now is captured, which is obviously a great overall figure. And then on the APP reimbursement regime, as Oliver said, the PSR sort of set the overall APP reimbursement regime from a policy perspective. But what we do as the payment system operator is, you know, we collect data and monitor the compliance of that data. We act appropriately on any of the breaches, but then we're in a position to report the data back to the PSR if there's any specific non-compliances that might need to be enforced against. And to support that, we've also gone a bit further than just the expectations on us placed by the regulator by building and developing a single claims management system that the institutions that are in scope of the PSR's reimbursement regime can utilise. And we think, you know, that system itself can evolve over time to produce even, you know, richer data, you know, as we get to better understand the kind of uses of fraud and the types of fraud going forward into the future.
And I think that's what you mentioned, Dave, about the usage of data, because Pay.UK is what is providing at the end is a centralized, let's say, registry of what is happening in the fast payment system. And I think that that's really a key element into the fraud prevention and also in the reimbursement and in the confirmation of payee, which, I mean, it obviously needs to have like a centralized form of information for someone in this payment chain, in this case, Pay.UK, to have all the information to be able to provide good information to all the participants or all the elements in the chain. And I think that's a key element in what is happening in the UK about facing fraud and scams in interoperable fast payment systems, because at the end, fast payments has been around for several years, if not decades perhaps, but it was like on as accounts. I mean, it was in the ledgers or the registers or the books of single banks, but now that is interoperable. I mean, it can go from one payment system provider to another bank and so on and so forth. The interoperability and to have centralized information about that interoperability is the key for all these efforts. So I think that's key for this.
Can I just come in on that? Because I think data is so critical here, and Dave indicated the data that Pay.UK is collecting and sharing with us, so that we can then share more widely. I think that one of the key answers to addressing fraud is the ability to share data across organizations. And I think one of the benefits that has come from the approach that we are taking with Pay.UK is that previously just wasn't there. It really helps, I think, firms to understand what's happening out there and therefore where best to position themselves. I think the other point on data, and we can probably get into some bit more detail, is that the data that we publish around origination of fraud is equally important, because that continues to shine a light on the fact that a lot of fraud originates not through sort of the banking process, but on social media and telecommunication and online platforms. And I think the fact that we now have that data really does help then push those parts of the kind of fraud chain to think about how they can play their part in combating fraud.
That's a great point, Oliver. Thank you. And I think that we're going to have some questions related to that. I mean, the difference of authorized payments and unauthorized, and in the sense that the authorized are dependent on that kind of, as you mentioned, social media, social platforms, and that having information and data about how those are becoming prevalent, that will help everyone to counter these problems. So that I think that goes into the direction that we're going to have into this conversation. So thank you.
Yeah.
For the second question, Oliver, could you provide insights in the most effective regulatory approaches that are being deployed to mitigate fraud and how they're evolving in response to emerging risks? And David, from an industry standpoint, how is PayUK leveraging data analytics, which that's the whole point that we were talking a couple of seconds ago, data, to strengthen the resilience of payment infrastructures against fraud? Oliver.
So, I mean, I touched on already the approach that we're taking, that balancing of consumer protection and incentivizing investment in fraud prevention. And I think that from a regulatory perspective, and particularly from an economic regulator perspective, that's an effective way of looking to mitigate fraud. Just in terms of some stats, it's useful just to highlight, since this went live in October, you've got around, and this is using the data that's being collected again, which is sort of helpful in terms of sort of shining a clear light on what's going on. Around 18,000 APP scams are claimed in October and November, which is around £18 million worth of fraud. 59% of those are reimbursed, which equates to about £10.5 million worth of fraud being refunded back to victims of that fraud. And you're seeing those claims being handled really quickly, so around 80+% within 5 days. So even though it's early days for the mandatory reimbursement regime, what those statistics show is that it's proving to be effective, that where people are the victim of fraud, then the financial institutions are responding very positively and in the way that we would have expected them to, and they are reimbursing the victims of fraud. And at the same time, all of the financial institutions continue to heavily invest in fraud prevention technology, and they recognise the sort of the importance of doing that. This kind of goes to a broader point around the role that addressing fraud plays in generating confidence in the UK economy. That if you deal with fraud, or you have a clear strategy that is proving to be effective in addressing fraud, then the UK becomes an even more attractive place to invest, an even more attractive place to invest, to do business. And so there's both a narrower from a customer perspective, but also that broader for a wider UK economy, that actually if the regulation works, it has a positive impact across the board.
That's great. Dave.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just I haven't got just to build on Oliver's stats figures from a moment ago. I mean, we're still assessing the latest stats, but we're seeing a real positive trajectory above even the figures that Oliver quoted a moment ago, which again, I guess is testament to the sort of initial successes of that reimbursement regime. I think to answer the question more specifically on data, I think maybe I'll answer it in a couple of ways. I think there's value that we'll start to see from the data that's coming across the reimbursement regime through the claims management system that we've developed on behalf of the industry. I think there's value in making sure that all of the payment service providers access that one system, because that will provide us with a richer set of data. I also think as we start to see data over that system, we could potentially start seeing emerging patterns and trends, and you would be able to utilize that data in the prevention and detection type solutions that Oliver talked about. So whereas the RCMS claims management solution I talked about is being set up with a very specific purpose at the moment. You could see a world where it could be extrapolated, so the data could be used also for the prevention and detection type solutions as well. We use what's called a specific reporting standard currently in our RCMS solution now, and without being too technical, there's a sort of specific set of data points that that PSPs need to provide, and we need to provide back to the payment systems regulator. But you could see a world where that evolves potentially to include something like URLs that could be identifying sort of fraudulent accounts, and then that again could be used in some of the prevention and detection type solutions. And I think the final point I would make is one of the things that we see from a PSO perspective is, we want to sort of create the conditions where sort of the greatest amount of useful data can be made available to the market to be able to develop these prevention and detection and solutions. I don't think we would claim that we're experts in that. There are sort of market experts that spend their time out there doing data analytic type solutions and fraud prevention and detection solutions. But I think what we can do is kind of harness that data in a safe way and make it available to the market to sort of develop on a competitive basis those solutions to the market, but by having a kind of minimum level whole of the market type solution so everyone benefits, and then allowing people to kind of innovate and compete across the top of that, we believe is really important from a kind of UK perspective. Because as Oliver says, some firms are investing heavily and well in fraud prevention and detection. And I think what we want to see is a minimum standard that everybody does, because fraudsters only ever move to the weakest part in the chain, as we know.
Yeah, that's great. I have a question about the reimbursement, because what I've read is that as you both mentioned it from since October last year, the reimbursement is mandatory. But as far as I remember, unless it is mandatory, unless the bank is able to prove that the user was negligent about, let's say, having some text message warning him about doing this payment or not. Are there already like data about how is the breakdown between reimbursement? I mean, that we know that it has increased, but those cases of that have not been that the reimbursement has not been, let's say, like mandated just because the client has been negligent about like the warnings. Is there any data about that?
I can come in on that.
Yeah.
And Dave will have the more up-to-date data on this. That sort of customer standard of caution, which I think you're kind of alluding to there, is really was a really critical and carefully thought through piece of the policy that we were developing. I think the figures are quite low in terms of the number of claims that are being rejected under that. I think it's a low single figure percentage of claims that are being rejected. And so I think what that probably means is that customers are alive to the warnings that are given to them when they're going through the payments process. Firms have invested heavily in providing good communication to their customers so that they understand the triggers to look out for when there might be when there might be potential fraud. And I think that firms themselves are being responsible when considering whether a claim should be rejected or not on the basis of potential negligence by the customer. They're being responsible in applying that. And that therefore has led to a pretty low percentage of claims being rejected on that basis.
That's great to know, Oliver. Thank you. So for the next question, we're going to make like this differentiation that there is sometimes in the industry about what is fraud and what's scam. So we're going to talk about the unauthorized payments, which are normally used as or in some parts of the industry as fraud, and the authorized push payments, which are sometimes known as scams. In the UK, it has been reported that unauthorized payments have been declining because of, let's say, biometric identification, some other types of profiling, and technological, like, let's say, thresholds or technological barriers for fraudsters to do something against the users. But we know that scams are on the rise, and scams are those which are that we referred to as authorized push payments, in which social media with SMS messages and some other types of social engineering can push people to do something, let's say against their will, but they're willing to do it. I mean, they just did it because they were convinced because of these tools. What best practices are emerging to protect users in the UK against scams? That's my question for both of you.
Yeah, maybe at a high level, I suspect we may have covered some of this anyway. I mean, Oliver talked a lot about the education campaigns that the industry and individual PSPs are launching, which are having, real positive effects. Education is key. But I often speak to what we call our sort of end user representatives, and education can only go so far. But education is really helpful. But we're seeing sort of an increase in education campaigns in the UK. I think we've started to see, as Oliver again said, examples of good sort of technology solutions that go in place before the payments are made, and confirmation of payee is a good example of that. And individual firms are implementing their own solutions as well. And again, I think the sort of reimbursement regime more generally that Oliver talked about is incentivizing best practice across the industry more generally. So sort of at a high level, they're the kind of elements of best practice and sort of regulatory intervention and industry developments that we're seeing to try and reduce the impacts and the occurrences of authorised push payment fraud within the UK.
Sorry, I was slightly distracted because, and this will be alien to many of the people who are listening from different parts of the country, the world. It's snowing in the UK at the moment, so I'm slightly distracted by that. Anyway. So I agree with Dave. I think education is really important, but I also think that what's important is seeing. It's tempting to think of fraud as a financial problem, and therefore it's for the banks to solve and the regulators of financial services to solve. And I think, obviously, that's a part of it. But you need a whole. So you need a national strategy for this, and that therefore requires each part of that of the country to come together to try to find a common ground on how best to address fraud. And you see, and I think what the UK can usefully do is to learn from other jurisdictions, and I know we'll come on to this in a bit more detail later, but there's some really positive, innovative approaches that are being taken around the world, where you have got that real sense of our country coming together to address fraud, and that global, that national approach is proving to be very, very successful. So I think education and helping consumers play their part in preventing fraud is important. Then I think there's the technology, and I've seen really excellent examples of how that is used very effectively in spotting fraud at the earliest point and pausing payments, but not in a way that creates a great deal of friction in the system, which is important from a consumer experience perspective. And then that national strategy to address fraud. And I think that's where some of the data that we've been collecting around fraud origination, as I said earlier, is really, really important to shine that light on the fact that fraud is originating here, and therefore that's where you should be focusing more of your effort if you're going to try and combat it in the first place.
That's great, Oliver and Dave. I'm going to mix two questions that I already had, because I think that we have already answered several things about how fraud detection and recovery mechanisms work. I think that we have already covered that a little bit, so I'm going to skip one question. But the next one has to do with a little bit of detail on those solutions. And in fact, in the Q&A widget, we have the first question is very straightforward: how this prevention works. So the next question is going to be a little bit about the let's say, like the methods. So Oliver, how is PSR engaging with AI-driven methodologies to enhance regulatory oversight and fraud mitigation? And on the other hand, David, how is PayUK harnessing AI to fortify fraud prevention strategies while ensuring system integrity and granting a positive user experience? Oliver.
If you don't mind, Dave, I wonder whether you might want to take this first, because I think I can talk about AI from a regulator's perspective, but I think maybe what's more interesting to the audience is what Pay.uk is doing in terms of its use of AI and around fraud prevention. So, Dave, do you want to go first?
Yeah, no, absolutely happy to. I say quite coincidentally, someone's posted something in the chat as well, actually, so somebody can read after on this. But yeah, it's probably very specifically to this question, actually. So back in 23, we conducted a fraud detection pilot in collaboration with the UK payments industry and some leading fraud prevention solution providers, where we trialed what's known as a new overlay service, which allowed sort of UK banks and building societies to analyse money flows and use predictive intelligence to proactively detect fraud and help prevent crime before it occurred. So that's classic prevention and detection stuff. The results of that pilot, really exceeded our expectations, but also the participants within that pilots, where we saw an average uplift of about 40% in fraud detection and a false positive rate of 5.1 instead of 10.1. So not only we saw greater uplift in detection, but also a reduction in the false positive rate, which is a really important thing when we talk about the overall integrity of the system, because what we don't want to be seeing is payments slowing down unnecessarily. So the pilot was a real success. So what we're doing now is working with the industry more generally about how we can roll that out, and we're in active conversations with infrastructure providers and the sort of PSP community in the UK to do that. So that's a kind of real practical example of sort of us working with the industry and sort of fintechs who have got specialism in these areas using AI technologies for the benefits of fraud. So yeah, a really, really good practical example from us.
And I guess more generally, from a regulator's perspective, obviously very interested in AI for how we operate as a regulator. But one of the things we're able to do is to capture a range of views from across industry and wider about the use of AI. So this is a feature of many of the conversations that we are having with industry about their use of AI, specifically in relation to fraud prevention. And then we're able to, in understanding that broader picture, identify good practice that can be shared, whether there are any particular barriers that might be being created by the approach the regulator is taking that could be lifted, how in making the most of the opportunities that come from AI, you are putting in place appropriate safeguards to mitigate the potential risk of the use of AI, and just understanding how that's working in practice. So our role is less to do with how we are using AI and more how we understand AI being used and therefore getting comfortable with it as the regulator.
That's great. Thank you, Oliver and Dave. I have a question for Dave. I mean, you mentioned something that I had not heard before about this overlay service for that you used like for a pilot. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, I should apologise for using industry terms on these podcasts. Actually, I'll get in trouble from that from my communications team. But really, what it means is, Pay.uk, operates the central infrastructure, and across the central infrastructure, data gets passed across that infrastructure. We don't see ourselves as experts in fraud analytics in the way that fraud analytic technology providers are, but what we can do is make that data available to those firms that are experts in those areas. So when I talk about overlay service providers, it's really those providers outside of the core infrastructure that can have specialism in these particular areas, but can use data that comes from the core services to enhance their individual products, is what I mean. So there's Fees as an example, or Featurespace do that, or Synetics do that, the kind of firms that operate in that area. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I would like to understand a little bit more. I mean, we understood, and that's part of the discussion, and that's one of the things that I would like to highlight when we make the wrap up of our conversation. It's about that sharing data is key, and that national strategy, as Oliver mentioned, is key for this. This overlay service is a way of like providing the data or facilitating the data to someone who is an expert on fraud prevention to provide that service based on the data that is shared by Pay.uk, something like that?
Yeah, that's broadly right. But clearly you need the right level of data protection and the data agreements to make that data available in the first place, which is something that Pay.uk can lead on. But then that data provided in a safe fashion to sort of third-party firms to do the kind of fraud prevention and detection analytics is the model that we would approach it. Yeah.
Okay, that's great, Dave.
And just one thing, Carlos, is that what in some countries you have a sort of single system for a single IT system for how you look at fraud prevention. In the UK, you've got sort of individual financial institutions looking at their own technology to develop fraud prevention. I think where Pay.UK comes in so helpfully is exactly as Dave was describing, is giving you the access to the data that then enables, when you are considering how to manage fraud within your own institutions, you can do so in a way that responds positively to the data that's being shown up.
Thank you. Something that Dave and Oliver, we were discussing just 5 minutes before we entered this session, is about the cross-border component. What are the considerations that right now in the UK are being, or what are the discussions that are being held right now about the cross-border component of fraud and scams? Is that something that that you can share your experience?
Do you want to go, Dave, or do you want me to?
I might let you lead off on that one if that's okay.
So, my perspective on this, and I'll perhaps be a bit broader and then maybe a bit more specific, is that fraud's a global issue, and different jurisdictions are taking different approaches. Payments are moving across different jurisdictions. And so there are also some different models for how payments infrastructure is managed and how regulation bites across different jurisdictions. And so you've got central banks that mandate policy and help ensure consistency of fraud strategy in some parts of the world. And my take on this, having spent a bit of time in Malaysia last year and Paris a couple of weeks ago on one of these sort of global payments conferences, is there's an enormous amount for us to learn from what happens in other jurisdictions, and where possible to kind of join up our understanding and why a particular approach is more or less effective in a particular jurisdiction, so that we can take advantage of that learning. And similarly, we know that there's a lot of interest in the approach that we're taking in the UK, and we're very happy and keen, and have done so, is to sort of share our experience of developing that policy, the problem that we had seen that we were trying to address, and to start sharing how this is working in practice, so that if it's useful in that jurisdiction, they can think about how that could be applied there. And I think in doing that, in building those connections across different jurisdictions, you start to touch upon that point about cross-border payments, and in that you understand how different jurisdictions are responding to the issue of fraud, and therefore you're able to try and find, wherever possible, a sort of common approach. That's the extent of it at the moment, but we do a lot of engagement within the PSR internationally, because fraud is such a global issue.
Yeah, I think the only build I think that's spot on. The only build I'd make on that is, from a kind of international PSO community, there's various live conversations about cross-border payments and potentially linking domestic ACHs with other domestic ACHs, and it's inevitable part of that conversation will sort of lead into a fraud conversation as and when that sort of discussion matures. And I think Oliver's right, having those conversations now in the early days and learning lessons from how individual jurisdictions are addressing the kind of fraud challenge will inevitably help when cross-border becomes a reality, I think.
That's great, Dave and Oliver. That's part of the question that we can you hear me? Yes. I think my internet dropped.
I lost you temporarily, but you
Okay.
appear to be back now.
Okay, thank you. So there are many jurisdictions that are entering the fast payments and the interoperable fast payments realm right now. we know in Latin America and some other jurisdictions. What would be, based on your experience in the UK, what is the advice to those jurisdictions? Where is the payment industry heading to tackle fraud and scams?
Yeah, I can go first on that one if it helps. Maybe just a few points, really. I think my first lesson would be, if you're developing or implementing a fast or instant payment solution, think about the sort of fraud solutions and the fraud mechanisms up front. I suspect it's easier to do earlier than retrospectively once established business models and so on are in place. So if that opportunity is available to you, I think there's lessons we could learn in the UK. We went live in 2008 with faster payments, but only really started to think about the APP issue sort of 9-10 years later. So I think there's something there. I think there's definite value in a whole of market approach if you can achieve that, making the data available on a whole of market basis to sort of level that playing field. And I think thinking outside of the payments industry, having a kind of holistic approach that involves all sectors, from payments industry to government to regulators to social media to telecoms, tied into the sort of national fraud strategy that Oliver talked about. I think those would be sort of 4 learnings that I would take from the last decade or so I've worked on these issues.
So mine would be, and I agree with all of Dave's points. From a regulator's perspective, mine would be get the regulatory framework right and make it proportionate. It's perhaps unusual for a regulator to be saying this, but I worry where regulators are too interventionist and are seen as either sort of blockers for innovation, or the only way in which you can affect change is through strong, firm regulation. And of course, sometimes that's necessary, but I think a much more effective use of regulation is to create that framework, to be very clear about what our expectations are, what outcome we're trying to achieve, and then to hand it over to the experts. In this case, you've got very experienced people who are responsible for running payment systems operators, and you don't want to stand in the way of them being able to use their expertise, so long as the safeguards are in place within that framework that promote competition, encourage innovation, and protect the interests of users. And so my take on the role that regulators can play in relation to the question is, don't stand in the way of enabling creativity and innovation, but do so in a way that creates the right guardrails that gives the protection that's necessary.
That's great, Dave and Oliver. Thank you. Those are the questions that we had. Now we're going to have a significant amount of time to answer several of the questions that the attendees have raised on the Q&A widget. I'm going to start with a very interesting one, I think, which is, how are banks dealing with the scam refund or reimbursement mandate? I mean, I think that the purpose is, how heavy is this? I mean, how difficult has this been financially, I guess?
Dave, do you want to, that feels like a question for you.
Well, we're seeing, I think, as Oliver talked about earlier, we're seeing, real uptick in sort of reimbursements through the regime. So, I mean, clearly, with any new system and service and new regime than this, there's sort of technical challenges and sort of operational challenges as we go through the implementation process. And leading up to the October the 7th date, was a big industry endeavour to get to that point. It took a lot of coordination, both from ourselves, the PSR, and the banking industry more generally. So I think in terms of sort of the operationalisation of the regime, things are going pretty well. So that would be my perspective on that. I don't know if Oliver's got any sort of reflections on the kind of policy itself and how that's landed, but from a kind of how it's been operationalised, it's been there since October. It's only March, but we're seeing a real sort of positive uptick in what we're seeing in terms of the statistics.
And I would say this, but I think the policy is a really good one from an economic regulatory perspective, that incentivizing firms whilst protecting consumers is a really powerful policy position for us to have taken. Now, the path to get through that policy was not a straightforward one, nor would you have expected it to be. But we think we landed in the right place. We listened very carefully to the range of views, and there were lots of views on this, and came to a conclusion that this was the proportionate approach to take. We've committed to an independent review after the first 12 months of operation. And so there's an opportunity through that, once you've got data and experience of the last 12 months of how that mandatory reimbursement regime has operated, to see whether it's delivered the outcomes that we were expecting. Has it created the right incentives? Is it providing the right kind of consumer protection? Is it still encouraging consumers to play their part in preventing fraud? And then there'll be a range of other things that we cover off in the review. But I think we're pleased with how this has gone in the first few months. As Dave says, when you're introducing anything of this scale, and this is a significant intervention, there are teething problems and there are challenges around consistency of approach, and there's a need for clarification as you go through. And I think we in Pay.UK have done a good job in being responsive to the questions that have come up and the teething problems that have emerged, and have responded to those quickly and proactively. And equally, industry has responded really positively to this, and they've played their part in the way that is necessary. And it's not easy for them. And in the absence of a single system, it's quite manual, and therefore it's resource intensive. And that will change once we get a single system in place. But yeah, we think after a lot of time and effort to get this into place that we thought we could move forward on, yeah, we're pretty pleased with how it's progressing. And I think that reflects the fact that everybody has seen this is a piece of work that only works if we all come together and make it work. This won't have worked if it just felt like we're doing this because the regulator has told us to. We're doing this because it's a positive way in which we can address the issues around fraud.
That's great. One question that is, there are two questions about the same topic, so I'm going to pick just one of those, but it will cover both, which is, are you considering measures to ensure consumers' accountability for fraudulent transactions? Current limits seem very high and might encourage consumers to be negligent. What do you think?
So this goes back to the point that we were talking about earlier around customer standard of caution and the gross negligence point. We thought hard about this because there's a potential argument which says if there's a mandatory requirement to reimburse, then customers are less focused on whether or not this is a fraudulent matter or not. We think that banks do a really good job of raising consumer awareness of fraud, and they put in place lots of warnings and education around what to look out for. You just see it yourself when you're making a payment to somebody. There are so many points where a red flag comes up and says, are you really sure you want to make this payment? Are you really, really sure you want to make this payment? And so in a way, there's a lot of support and help for customers to make sure that they don't fall victims of fraud. But I think it is right that customers have a part to play. And if somebody is flagrantly disregarding all of the advice and guidance they're being given, then I think it's right that there is some protection put in place in that, in terms of our expectations around reimbursing. As I said, the stats show that's being applied in a very, very small percentage of cases, which I think is a positive in a number of different directions. And it's something that we will keep under very close review. And we know it was a point of part of the policy that generated quite a lot of discussion. But we think it was the right place to start, and we'll include that as part of the independent review.
That's great, Oliver and Dave. Thank you. Next question is directed to PSR. So, Oliver, are you looking at broader regulation, working with other regulators to incentivize other sectors, such as telco, social media, to play a role in fraud prevention?
We are, as I said earlier, we've got this fraud origination data that we published in December last year, which showed that a significant percentage of authorized push payment fraud emanates from social media, telecommunication, online platforms. There's a national task force looking at fraud that includes social media companies. There's a limit to what we, as the regulator of payment systems, can do to require social media companies to behave differently, to invest more, respond differently to addressing fraud. But we think that being able to show the data and how that supports the long-held view that much of the fraud originates there encourages encourages those companies to think hard about how they can improve their protection around fraud. And we're seeing them coming to the table and recognizing the role that they play. And so that, I think, is moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Oliver. There's a question which is related to something that we have discussed about having like this national strategy and also like national data sharing, let's call it like this. It is the following. Is there a platform or authority in the UK to allow financial institutions to share information about parties related to fraud or suspected fraud activities?
I'm not sure. Phil, I'd have to take that one away unless Oliver's got an answer to that. Unless you know, Oliver.
I don't know of any. I mean, obviously, Pay.UK collect a lot of data on this, and in turn, we also have data. But if there's I'm not aware of there being a sort of separate authority that collects this kind of information. But it may be that I just don't know the answer to that.
I mean, I do know there's been sort of conversations at sort of Home Office type level around the ability to create, areas where you can collect certain different types of data to try and sort of help with fraudulent activity more generally. But I'm not aware of, and certainly the way the question's drafted, I can't think of an institution that currently does this. But, yeah, I might take that away and do some digging, and if I find the answer, I'll send it around afterwards. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to take two more and we're going to finish the session. So the first one is, with fraud tactics constantly evolving, what measures are in place to ensure that the regulatory frameworks remain agile and adaptable without creating unnecessary compliance burdens?
I mean, that goes back a bit to what I have said before. It's interesting, agile and adaptable are not things you would normally apply to regulatory frameworks, but I do think the PSR is pretty good at responding quickly where it sees that a particular policy might not necessarily be delivering the right kind of outcome. I mean, I think the slightly dry answer is that in order to effect change and for regulation to change, there's a process that needs to be followed to ensure that it stands up to scrutiny. But within that, there is sufficient flexibility and agility to, if there's a need for clarification or a need for some additional guidance, to help people better understand what's expected by way of compliance, and we're prepared to give that. Equally, Pay.UK have an important role to play here, because they're the ones who have the direct contact into their members, and therefore will understand whether there are compliance issues that they need to work through, or whether there are individual issues that are being considered by a particular institution, or systemic challenges that the regulator can help with. So I think the answer probably is that it's important that PSR and Pay.UK work very closely together to identify these particular issues, and we have in place a process that we can respond to them. And then at the longer level, you've got that 12-month independent review.
Thank you. And I'm going to, the last one is mine, in fact, because that's something that I have been discussing with some people in the UK, which is about the 50-50, let's say, reimbursement mandate for this 50% for the sender and 50% for the receiver bank, what is the economic rationale behind sharing it like 50-50? Because at the end, I would say that the sender bank is the one which has like more responsibility. I'm not saying that the receiver has zero responsibility, but how did you come up with the 50-50?
I mean, there's quite a lot of material on this, but at a very high level, and bearing in mind we've got a couple of minutes left, this was designed to incentivize across institutions, and so by splitting it equally, you place the equal incentive on both sides of the payment transaction to take responsibility for reimbursing, but more importantly, to recognise that they have their part to play in preventing fraud in the first place. So that was I mean, that's it at a very high level, but there's a lot more depth to the answer that I've just given that's available on our website.
Oh, that's great. We'll look for that. So, Oliver, Dave, thank you very much for joining us today. It has been a very interesting, very lively conversation. I would like to wrap up very quickly, just a couple of bullets of what I can share with the audience about what I think it's perhaps the most important, and please feel free to add something if I'm missing anything. The first one is sharing data is the key among the industry participants. That's key. Second, the need for a national strategy for it to, I mean, for the fraud prevention and for the fraud prevention or the fraud counter strategy to work well. You need a national strategy. You need upfront, to tackle the problem upfront, not as I think it was Dave who mentioned that the fast payment system started in 2008, but let's say that the efforts to counter authorized push payments started in 2018. So perhaps doing it upfront, doing it early, it makes a lot of sense. Also having a holistic approach to do this to fraud prevention, and also, as Oliver mentioned, to get the regulatory framework right from the start. It's important. So that's like my wrap up, and I think that's the contribution to the discussion for some other jurisdictions that are having the same problems that will have them in the near future. So once again, thank you both for joining us today. This is the end of the payment system broadcast. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks very much.
And we're going to meet soon once again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.